Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Nun Daled. Today's daf is sponsored by Deborah Ashheim Weiss on the occasion of the 45th yahrzeit of her beloved father, David Ashheim. He left us too early, but he left a lasting love of Israel, Jewish values, and family. Okay, we're going to get started with Chizkiah. Chizkiah is going to try to prove something we saw at the very end of yesterday's daf, that we were talking about an altar and the difference between a bimus and an altar. This was to prove Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, who basically Ula was going like them when he sat on this broken bimus. But a broken altar, we're going to see, is not permitted until its majority of it is destroyed. And another difference between them is a bimus is made of one stone and an altar is made of multiple stones. So Chizkiah says, Mikra. What's the pasuk that proves both these things about the altar? We're going to have one verse in Yeshayahu where we can learn both things. Number one, it's made of different stones. Number two, it's not permitted until it's completely or mostly broken. Bisumo kol avnei mizbeach ka'avnei gir menupatzot. When they are put all the stones of the altar like limestone that is broken into pieces, then lo yakumu asherim v'chamanim. Then there will no longer be asherim and chamanim, a type of idol. So the way they understand this pasuk is i'ika kavnei gir menupatzot. If they are like broken pieces, lo yakumu asherim v'chamanim. Then there will no longer be idols, meaning this won't be considered forbidden like idols. Ilav, if not yakumu, these will be not that they'll be considered idols, they'll be used for idol worship. Okay, so the altar is going to be used for idol worship as long as it's not broken. Once it's broken, it won't be used for idol worship, and then once it's not used for idol worship, then it will be nullified, but only once the majority of it is broken. Now we're going to bring a braita that we're going to deal with for the next little while. Ne'ebad. Okay, if something is worshipped, it will be forbidden to benefit, but it depends. Shalom asul, v'shel chavero mutar. If somebody worships someone else's idol, that doesn't forbid the idol, because we've learned this a number of times already. Ein adam osel davar she'eno shelo. A person is not allowed to forbid something that doesn't belong to them. I can't walk into your house, start worshiping something, and then claim, right, now I forbade something in your house to be forbidden to benefit from. That's not fair. It's not mine. I don't have the jurisdiction in your house or to your property to take it and make it forbidden to you. That would be ridiculous. So that's a very basic halacha. However, it seems to contradict the following source. Ulemimhi, that contradicts this source. Ezehu ne'ebad, what is considered worshipped? There's going to be one word in here that's going to bother us. Kol she'ovdinoto, okay, anything that's worshipped so far sounds good. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mizi, whether it was unwitting or intentional. Bein ba'ones, bein b'ratzon, whether it was forced or whether it was with my will. So the issue is going to be with the word onus. And the Gemara is going to suggest, hi onus hechigami. What do we think the case of onus is? Lav kigon, is it not the anas be'emat chavirovish tachavala? Sounds like somebody, anas is forced, but in this context, they think it means, I stole your animal, okay, anas be'emat chavirovish tachavala. What could be forced about it? We're assuming right now, obviously there's other ways of force, but we assume right now what it means is, I forcibly stole your animal and worshipped it. And that would be be'ones, that your animal was worshipped be'ones. It wasn't your doing, it was someone else's doing, someone stole your animal, which would contradict the previous source that said, I don't have the power to mess up your animal. So the first answer we're going to have is Rami Bar Chama. I'm a Rami Bar Chama. No, that's not the way, it's not what onus means. What onus means is, kagon shansu of de kochavim, fishtachava lebehem tel didei. We're going to have to create a case here, Rami Bar Chama says, where the person worshipped their own animal. So what could be forced then about it? Well, a Gentile could come over to you, put a gun to your head and say, if you don't worship this animal, I'll kill you. And that's what we're talking about. And then the person bowed down, right, to their own animal because they were forced. But now before we get to the second answer, we're going to deal with this first answer. Maskefla Rabbi says, what do you mean? How could this be a problem? How could you say that this would forbid the animal? Don't we say, Ones Rahmana Patre, very famous line. The Torah basically permits someone, or exempts is the word, exempts someone who did it when they were forced. What's the perfect proof for this? A woman who was raped. If the woman was raped, the Nara Murasa, the in-between stage where she was a Nara, she was a young woman, she gets raped and she screams and nobody helps her, right? So Nothing happens to her. She doesn't get punished. Remember, she was murasa. She was already betrothed to someone. She was like a married woman, even though she wasn't exactly married. Halakhically, that's considered neshadish. And if she willingly did it, then it would be a different story. Then she would get the death penalty. She gets stoned. But if not, nothing happens to her because ones rachmana patre. That's our proof. Torah permits someone who did something bonus. So if they permit someone who did it in case of onus, wouldn't we then assume that the object wouldn't be considered nevad? The person didn't really mean to worship it. They were forced to. So Ella Amarava, Rava says, no, that's not true because Hakol hayu bichlal lo ta'avdim. Originally, everything, you can't worship anything, okay? Even, let's say, ba'ones. Ukishapiret lecha katuv v'chai behem v'lo shiyamu behem yatsa ones. However, then came the pasuk that said v'chai behem. You're supposed to live by them, which means if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, do this or I'll kill you, you actually are permitted to do it. And then onus is no longer, that would get you to onus rachmana patre. You'll be exempt. But hadar katav rachmana v'lo techalalu Hashem kodshi ta'afilu ba'ones. So then the Torah said, wait, don't desecrate my name, even in onus. That's even though you're forced to do it. So haketzad, how do we reconcile this? On the one hand, there's onus rachmana patre, and there's v'chai behem, supposed to live by them. So he answers ha b'tzina, ha b'ferhesia. So now we're going to have a different answer to this contradiction. We're going to say it depends whether it was done privately or whether it was done publicly. Okay, this sugya, by the way, you have to raise a question here because what happened to Yereg Val Yavor other than the three things of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, Shfichut Damim? This seems to not go along the lines of that Avodah Zarah is an exception to the rule. It seems like these things, it all depends. It doesn't depend on the three big things. It depends on sina for hesi. It depends whether you're in public or private. If they force you to do it in public, then you're exempt. If they force in private, you're exempt. If they force you to do it in public, then you're not exempt. Okay, you should really get killed for it. Okay, and that's lo techalalu. Don't desecrate God's name in public. So now we're going to answer this question by saying, it's going to be nevad if you did it in public, because then you really shouldn't have done it even if they forced you, and therefore it will become forbidden. Whereas when the Braita said nevad shelo asur v'shel chavero mutal, that's if you worship someone's idol in private and not in public. Public means 10 people, like a minyan kind of thing. Amrule Rabbanan Rava. Tanya de Alach. So the rabbi said to Rava, we have a Braita to support your reading. So now they say, here's our Braita. Bimusia'ot shel goyim b'sha'at hashmad, ava pi sha'ashma batel, ota bimusia'ot lo batlu. Here's a good proof, because what does it say? The bimusia'ot, the platforms that were used in Shat Hashmad, they were used by the Jews. They were forced to do it by the Gentiles in Shat Hashmad, right? That means when they're trying to get the Jews to not be Jewish anymore. Even though the Shat Hashmad is not existing anymore, in other words, we might have passed that period. However, they're still going to forbid those platforms that they used to worship idols at the time. Amar, okay, so that's a perfect proof for Rava, because that's what he said. If it was done in public, then they're not batel. They're not nullified. Amar lehu im shumha lo tisayan. But then, when the rabbi said this to Rava said, no. From there, you can't really prove it. Why? Amar Yisrael Momar Havu Palach La Biratzam. What happens in Shat Hashmad? Sometimes the Jews end up really deciding, okay, you know what, it's not worth it for me. I'll just become a Gentile. And maybe they ended up worshiping the idols willingly. And that's why they're forbidden. It doesn't necessarily prove that if they were forced, because there were a lot of Jews who actually converted, so to speak, to whatever it might have been at the time, the Romans, to their pagan religion, and did it willingly. Rav Ashi Amar, lo tema emal, ela vadai Yisrael mumar hava upalach labaratzam. Rav Ashi just responds to the previous statement of Rava and says, don't even say maybe they did. For sure they did. There were definitely lots of Jews that left willingly and went to worship idols. So even though, right, it wasn't their original intent, but they ended up doing that. And therefore, he said, for sure, this doesn't prove anything. Chizkiah Amar. Kigon shenisech. Now, Chizkiah comes up with a different explanation. He says we're going to talk about the um, the nevad. So again, we have somebody worshiping someone else's idol, and we say one source seems to say it wasn't forbidden, and the other source seems to say it is forbidden because assuming we understand onus as you were forced into it. I'm sorry, we can understand onus as somebody took your idol and worshipped it. That will forbid it. So how can we explain that? So Chizkiah Amar, Kigon shenisech lavodah zarah yayin al karneha. So what Chizkiah is going to say, we're going to understand this a little better as we go on, but what it's going to seem to mean is if they did an action, it wasn't just bowing down, but they did an action to the idol. So the first suggestion he says, first way he says it is, they poured a libation on the karnaim, the horns of the animal. So they poured wine libation onto the animal's horns for the purpose of idol worship. So Makavar of Ava, that doesn't mean you worshipped the animal. That's just Haibimus Ba'almahu Visharia. That would not forbid the animal because that's just pouring wine onto the the horns, but it's more like you're using the horns as a way to worship the the animal. Okay, the issue here, by the way, is that the an animal is normally we say the animal is forbidden, but if you do something to the animal, then you actually forbid it. So he says if you do it al karneha, it's a problem. But Rav Ava says that's not nevad. That's just use. Now it's hard to understand exactly the reality here, but what they're saying is when you pour on the horns, because the horns are kind of a separate part of the animal, it's really just like using it as a platform to worship the idol, and it's permitted. Ela amar of Adabar Ava kigon shenisechla yain ben karneha to ave ba maaser. Now the real issue is not if you do it on the horns, it's if you do it between the horns, which means really on the animal itself. And then you're actually doing a maase, you're doing an action. Again, it's always more an action than when you're doing just bowing, right? Bowing is an action, but you didn't do an action to the idol itself. So this is actually an issue, okay? I just want to go back for one quick minute. So I think there's something I need to correct you. Right. I remember. Okay. I suggested before that Rava was coming up with a different explanation, but Rava was actually correcting Rami Bar Chama. So again, let me go back for one quick minute and review. Rami Bar Chama had said that on Suhu of De Kochavim, and they forced the person to bow down to their own idol, which Rabbi Zera said, no, onus Rahman Patre. And then Rava, the issue is that the word Ella probably shouldn't be there. And Ella throws things off because it makes it sound like Rav is giving an additional answer, but it's not an additional answer. It should be without the word Ella, according to many of the commentaries. And it should be Amar Rava. And then Rava comes up with this explanation that Ones Rahmana Patre is only in certain situations. And therefore, what he was doing was really explaining Rami Bar Chama, that when we say the Gentiles forced someone to worship their own idol, that's going to be a problem if it's in public. If it's not in public, then it's not going to be a problem. And that's how it's just really coming to explain Rabbi Bar Chama. And now we're getting actually to answer number 2. So answer number 2 is that we're going to go back and say that it's not what we thought, but it really is somebody took someone else's idol and worshiped it. It's not that somebody forced someone to worship their own idol. But what they did was they actually did an action to the idol. And if you do an action to someone else's idol, you actually can forbid it. Okay, and that's what he's saying. And in the end, it's not on the horns, it's actually between the horns. The exact difference is hard to really understand, but it seems to be doing it on the animal rather than between the horns on the horns of the animal. So now they're going to say, now we're going to have similar statements. Ula, we're back to Ula again. When Ula came from Babylonia, he told us that Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the Rabbi Yochanan said, he's going to say the same thing here, by the way. Even though they say that someone who bows to their friend's idol does not forbid it. However, asaba maaseh asara. But if they do an action to it, they actually forbid it. Amar lahu Rav Nachman, and then Rav Nachman also said in Babylonia, Puku va'amru Ula. When he heard Ula say this, he said, "Go out and tell Ula." Kfar tirgama Rav Huna l'shmatech b'Bavel. Okay, Rav Huna already said what you said in Babylonia. In other words, don't come and brag that your rabbi in Israel said this, because we said the same thing in Babylonia. Ta'amar Rav Huna, if the animal of another of your friend was bowing, was crouched down, so to speak, in front of the Avodah Zarah, and that person goes over and slaughters one of the simanim of the animal as if to offer it to the idol, they forbid the animal. Minala da asra. So now, okay, and then that's basically it. In other words, again, you see doing an action of offering this animal to the idol, that can forbid the animal, even though it's not their own. So we end up with this second answer, which is this distinction between, well, on the one hand, I can't forbid someone else, I can't come into someone's house, bow down to it, and turn someone's idol into an idol. But if I actually did an action to it, like worshiping it, pouring the libation, slaughtering it, something like that, right, using it as a way to worship an idol, then it would be forbidden. Now they want to know, how do we know this is forbidden? And they're going to bring up a kind of strange comparison. Commentaries talk about how it's not exactly comparable, but we'll try to see how it is somewhat comparable. Ilema mikohanim. Maybe we learn from kohanim. Now, kohanim we're going to say right now is kohanim. We're talking about kohanim who worshipped in a temple of idols. Now, generally, they did it because they were forced to do it. Okay, so they were taken by force to worship these idols, and then they can't come back and work in the temple anymore. So now they're going to say, maybe we learn it from there. That's something that even if the person wasn't intending to worship it necessarily, or you could take, like the Gentiles took the Kohanim, forced them to do something. I'm trying to come up with comparisons, right? It wasn't like they wanted to, but it kind of happened to them. So, and yet they're now forbidden. Maybe it's the same thing, but they say no, because don't shani Kohanim to b'nei deyaninu. No, because Kohanim, we could say they were penalized in the end because they did have dot. They have knowledge. They're not like inanimate objects. We've seen this comparison before between the Kohen and things that are inanimate. And the Kohanim in the end, no, they didn't really have choice. They were forced, but still there's something different about it because those were humans who did an action worked in a temple, as opposed to an object that somebody came and did something to the animal, or to the idol or to the object. It wasn't like the object had anything to do with it. Maybe maybe we could learn from the stones of the altar, but what's the problem? Remember the stones of the altar of the Greeks, that we ended up saying that they had to be left there to do Geniza, they were forbidden forever. So they say no, because they're Dilma Kidderov Papa. You remember, right? This is Rav Papa had said, there's a special pasuk that they came in Chililum. If you remember, there's the whole question there, and the reason why they tried to learn it from there was because that belonged to somebody else. And if you remember, right, that belonged to the Jews. The Greeks came in and used them for their idols, but it wasn't theirs to use. And therefore, you see, maybe from there we could see that if you did something to it, they must have done something to the objects in the temple, and basically that shows that they're forbidden. They became forbidden because the Jews then buried them. But they say, if you remember, there was this lishka where they put them. But Rav Papa answered that was based on a unique pasuk, that they came b'chililum. If you remember, they made a chulin, and when they made a chulin, it became hefker, became ownerless, and then they actually became the owners of it. So this isn't a good example either. Okay, moving now to Amud Bet, Elami Keli. Maybe we could learn it from vessels. What do we know about the vessels? Dichtiv, it says, Et kol hakelim asher izniach hamelech achaz b'malchuto, b'ma'alo hechanu v'ikdash. So this pasuk as well. It says here, right? We just saw this on Nun Bet. The kelim that Achaz left behind, Chizkiyahu did this reformation, and what did he do with them? Hechanu v'ikdashnu. What did we explain? Hechanu v'ikdashnu. Hechanu shegnazum v'ikdashnu shekdashnu acharim tachteim. Now, he took these kelim, right, that were not his, and then he used them for idol worship. So wouldn't that be a good example here? In the end, they were forbidden, even though they weren't his. And again, I just want to remind you, this happened before Hestia in public. So now they're going to say, and this explains the option that once you do an action to it, they become forbidden. Okay, so I was mentioning before the way you can explain it the first way, according to Rava, which was explaining Rami Barhama about maybe because it was done in public, but that's different actually, because that was all explaining the opinion that you actually use your own idols. So we could put that aside. But really what this is coming to explain is the second answer, that you really can't forbid something that's not yours, but you can if you actually do an action to it. Okay, and that's what we explain. So because they did an action to it, okay, and that's how we have, that's Chizkiah's answer, that once you do something to it, you can actually forbid it. So to summarize this section, we started with this Braita. Okay, the first thing we did today was just the stones on the altar. But then we am proving a pasuk of the two things we said yesterday about them. But now we're going to this Braita, which contradicted another Braita about whether ne'avad, could you actually forbid something that wasn't yours? And it sounds that way from the onus. So either we say it's actually not talking about something that wasn't yours and it's actually your own. And for that, we had to explain, well, what'd you do wrong if someone forced you to do it? Well, you did it in public and therefore were forced to do it. And that makes it forbidden. And that's why the object will be forbidden. But Chizkiah says, no, it's actually your own, the simple reading that somebody grabbed it from you, worshipped it, and then it was forced upon you that it was now a worshipped item. But they had to have done an action to it. If they actually do an action to it, so I can't just go into your house, bow to something and forbid it, but I could go into your house, do an action to your idol, which is hard to imagine because the whole concept of can't forbid something that's not yours. But once you do an action to it, it's kind of like it's too late. Okay, once it's just on a scale, bowing is one thing, but actually doing an action to the idol or to something that's worshiping the idol, that's already much more serious. Now we're going to have some other things about Avodah Zarah. So Rav Dimi came from Babylonia, and he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, even though if you bow down to the ground, you don't forbid the ground, because we learned that, Elohim al ha'arim, but not harim Elohim. But if you dug something in the ground to worship that, okay, to worship the space or something like that, or you dug a cave for the purposes of Avodah Zarah, then that area would actually be forbidden. The ground itself, no, but the area that you dug up, yes. This is similar to, by the way, doing an action, right? How doing an action changes something that couldn't be forbidden to forbidden. It's different, but it's similar idea. Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Rabbi Yochanan, another person less known, Shmuel Bar Yehuda, who brought the Torah of Rabbi Yochanan also. Even though if you bow down to animals, you don't forbid animals, because animals are like land in that sense, they don't become forbidden. However, if you had an idol that was an animal that people were worshiping, you sold it, the money that you got, or you traded it for something, the item that you traded it for is also going to be forbidden. Okay, so the animal itself won't be, but what you traded it for is. And Kiata Ravin Amal, when Ravin came from Israel, he actually said there's a machloket within this issue. Pligi bar Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbanan, Chad amar chalipin asurin, chalipei chalipin mutarin, v'chad amar chalipei chalipin nami asurin. So we have a machloket. What if I took my Avodah Zarah, I traded it for your donkey, let's say, and then I took your donkey and I traded it for something else. So while the donkey has also the forbidden, right? The donkey itself is forbidden, but even the chalifei chalifin is, if I trade the donkey now for something else, does that item become forbidden as well? That's a subject of debate. So everyone agrees the chalipin is forbidden. The question is if you trade that item for something else, is that also forbidden? So now we're going to see the reasoning for this. My time on demand amar chalipei chalipin asulin. What's the reason to say that trading that second item is also going to transfer the forbiddenness to the third item? Amar kra v'hayita cherem kamohu. Kol she'atam mahayem mimenu hareu kamohu. They're focusing on the word hayita. Okay, it will be cherem like it. Okay, so now they're going to say, and I'll read you the pasuk. Lo tavi to'eva beitecha. Don't bring something despicable into your house. That's the idol. V'hayita cherem kamohu. and you will be cherem like it, or something along those lines. What they say here, the hayita, is you can create anything you make like it from it is going to be forbidden. So anything, even, right, even a few switches. Ve'ida, what's the other person going to say? Well, it says at the end of that pasuk, shaketz shaksenu v'ta'ev t'ta'avenu ki cherem hu, because it is cherem. Now, hu means just it and not something else. So from there, they learned hu velo chalipe chalipin. In other words, if you trade it once, yes. But beyond that, just it becomes forbidden and not anything else. Now, the one who ignores that drasha and says, no, there is no such drasha because they think chalipin is a sulin. Well, idach, what's he going to do with that word who? Well, that's to exclude something else. Now, orla and kilea kerem, this is the third year, the first 3 years of the fruits of a tree after you plant it, and kilea kerem are if you crossbreed vineyard with grains. Those things are forbidden to benefit from. However, when they say ki cherem hu, what they mean is avodah zarah, this whole chalipin thing becomes forbidden also. But if you sold orla or kalea kerem, which you weren't supposed to have anyway, but you sold it, you're not allowed to sell it. But if you did, well, the money you got for that sale is no longer forbidden to benefit from. And if you betrothed a woman, mikudeshet, she'll be betrothed, meaning it's your money. Okay, it's not forbidden to benefit from. So the kicherem hu means this only works for avodah zarah, but not for anything else. V'idach, well, what's the other person going to say? In other words, they don't have the word hu free to do that because they use the word hu for chalipin and not chalipe chalipin. So idach or the v'kileakerem l'tzricha miyuta. You don't need a drasha to say that this doesn't work. Why? Because to have avodah zarah u'shvi'it shnei ktuvim habein ke'echad v'kol shnei ktuvim habein ke'echad ein melamdim. Because we have this principle. Principle is if something appears once in the Torah, we can learn all other examples unless otherwise excluded. If we have it in 2 places, then it means this is only true for those 2 places and it's not true for any other situation. So if we can prove that this idea of chalipin being forbidden, that if I switch something to something else or trade it, barter it, sell it, what I end up getting in its place actually is going to be forbidden as well or have the same status, that appears twice in the Torah, which means if it appears twice, it's not taught anywhere else, which means I don't need a special drasha to say orla and kilea kerem are excluded from this principle because there was no reason even to think to include them. So what are these cases? So avodah zarah, hadamaran. Okay, avodah zarah we already explained that we said vayita cherem kamo, anything that comes from it will be forbidden. Shvi'it, when it comes to Shemitah, where does it say? What do we learn from? Right, this means if I have Shemitah produce and I sell it, then what I get in exchange is going to have all the sanctity of the Shemitah year as well. Dichtiv ki yovel hi kodesh tia lachem. Ma kodesh. So they talk about it. The context here it's yovel, but it's relating also to Shemitah. And they say it's kodesh. Now, what does it mean kodesh here? Well, they're going to say, it's just like kedusha. Ma kodesh tofeset tama v'asur. Ashvi tofeset etama v'asura. Sanctified items you can redeem onto coins, and then the coin gets the status of the sanctified item. So shvi'id is just like that as well. Then they say, wait a minute, but ima kodesh tofeset tama v'yoseh l'chulin, it's not really true because it's not the same as kodesh. When I have something kodesh, let's say I say I'm bringing this, let's say couch to the temple, because it's always a good example because you can't really bring your couch to the temple. I'm giving my couch to the temple. I'm dedicating it, I guess it would be the right word, dedicating it to the temple. Then I have to take the value of that and bring it to the temple. Now my couch no longer has sanctity to it once I take the money. It's removed. With Shemitah, it doesn't work that way. With Shemitah, the Shemitah produce is still Shemitah produce. I can't redeem it onto a coin. It's just that if I sold the Shemitah produce, then the Shemitah produce would still have the sanctity of Kedushat Shvi'it, of the 7th year. But also whatever I traded it for, let's say I traded it for fruits from the year before, they'll also have the sanctity of Shemitah upon them. So it's not the same because, just, again, ima kodesh tofes dama v'yoseh l'chulin, it goes on to the money and then the original object is no longer sanctified. Ashvi tofes dama v'yoseh l'chulin, and it doesn't. So if you're really going to say we learn it from ki yovel hi kodesh yelachem, it should be just like kodesh, and the Shemitah law should be removed from the original produce. Well, Talmud Lomar, there's a special ruling here, special pasuk, tihiyeh. Okay, Kodesh tihiyeh lechem. Tihiyeh means b'havalata tehe. It stays in its original sanctified state. So whatever had kedushat shvit, it's not removed. It's just kind of doubled. Now moves on to the other object. So haketzad, now they're going to explain how it works because there's one other thing they have to tell you just so you understand it up to the end. Lakach beperot shvi basar. So let's say you took meat, you bought, right, you paid for Shemitah produce with meat. So elu ve'elu mitba'arim b'shvi. They both have to be destroyed. This is one of the rules of Shemitah, that when it's no longer in the fields, you have to destroy it. Your animal can't eat anymore in the fields. You have to destroy it from your house. So the meat would have to be destroyed at the same time that the produce is destroyed. Lakach b'basar dagim. Now, you sold your Shemitah produce for meat. Now you have meat. If you sold the meat for dagim, for fish, yatsa basar nechnesu dagim. So now it actually does leave the meat because the meat isn't the Shemitah produce itself. The Shemitah produce is always going to stay. Okay, let's say I had some oranges. I sold them for meat. The oranges are always going to have the rules of Shemitah on them. But if I sell the meat now for fish, then whatever was on the meat got removed and is now on the fish. The dagim yayin, yatsu dagim, nichnas yayin. If I then traded the fish for wine, it would leave the fish and we would go on the wine. The yayin shemen, yatsa yayin, nichnas shemen. If I traded that wine for oil, then, okay, they don't need to go this far, but they're going anyway, then the oil would be. Haketzad, how does it work? Acharon yitpas b'shvi'it, upriyat moasu. This is what I said. The last one will have the Shemitah status on it, and the original fruits will also have it. The idach, okay, now we just have to go back to this ping pong. The one who said you need the word cherem hu to exclude orlin kilei kerem, why do they need a special pasuk to exclude it? We already said shneik tuvim ve'im kecharem elamdim. So idach kasavar shneik tuvim ve'im kecharem elamdim v'itzrichu lemeutim. Now there is an opinion that says actually 2 times is really like 1 time, and you really could learn from there for everything else, and that's why you need a special pasuk to exclude. Those who hold 2 times does teach you the general rule, hold that if 3 times, though, then not. But 1 or 2 times would still just be a general rule for everywhere. Now we get into a new Mishnah. I will preface this with saying that we're now basically ending this section of the Masechet. Okay? We started our Masechet. I'll do like a very brief overview. We started with the whole laws of the holidays, what you can do on their holidays, what you can't do, business dealings, all that. We moved to like bishul akum and foods that were forbidden, things like that. We moved from there to how does idol worship work? How do they worship their idols? What's considered worship, not worship, all that. And now we're going to move to Yein Nesach. Okay, that's wine that they used, right? That you get wine, the Gentile used. We're concerned they offered up to their gods. We're going to get into a whole topic of that, very relevant nowadays, right? Not having, right, have to be careful with your wine that doesn't come in contact with a non-Jew. Again, we'll get to all that when we get to it inside. But before we get there, it's almost like they want to end this whole section with a little bit of a zoom out and more like, well, if this idol worship stuff is so bad, then why? Okay, and we're going to see their questions. Okay, why are there idol worshipers in the world? Why hasn't God made it that they just don't exist anymore or destroy their idols or things like that? And it's going to come in the context of a conversation between a Roman and the rabbis, okay? As classic is, where the Romans say, oh, if you're so right, then why, blah, blah, blah. So Sha'alu et Hazkinim beRomi. Here's a mission. The elders in Romi, they asked the Sha'alu et Hazkinim beRomi, meaning in Rome, they asked the elders, our elders, God doesn't like idols, so why doesn't he destroy them? אמרו להם, אילו לדבר שאין צורך לעולם בו היו עובדים, היה מבטלו. If people were worshiping things that the world didn't need, then yes, God would destroy them. But הרי הם עובדים לחמה וללבנה ולכוכבים ולמזלות. יאבד עולמו בפני השוטים. Here's a great line, right? If they're worshiping the sun, the moon, the stars, the constellations, what? God's going to destroy all these things that people need because of fools who are worshiping idols. What? God's going to destroy all these things that humans need in the world? Amru lahen, so the Romans said back to them, Im ken yabed davar she'en tzorach le'olam bo, v'yaneach davar she'tzorach ha'olam bo. Well, fine. So I understand you're not going to destroy the sun, the moon, and all those things. But what about the Atzei Asherah? What about the stones? What about all those other things that we're worshiping? The world doesn't need those. Why don't you destroy those? Why doesn't your God destroy those? Amru lahen, af anu machzikim yedei avdehem shel elu. If God were to do that, that would strengthen those who worship the sun and the moon. Why? They'd say, Shomrim, they do shehein elohot, sharehein lo bitzlu. They make a comparison. They'd say, oh, maybe the Yatzei Asherah and all those idols are nothing. But look, the sun and the moon are still there. They didn't get destroyed. That must prove that they're actually real. Okay? So there's the back and forth. Now this is going to continue in the Gemara with Breita. It's going to say, okay, we're going to have different Breita. They're going to talk about these conversations they had. Tanu Rabbanan Shalu Filosofim et Zkenim Beromi. Okay, the philosophers asked the questions to the Zkenim in Rome. Which by the way was also the same in the Mishnah, it just didn't say the word Filosofim, but that's what it meant. Okay, same idea. Why doesn't your God not destroy these idols? They said back to them, it's the exact same thing as our Mishnah, right? If it was something the world didn't need, then you're right. Now here they add a little bit more, which is the world works in a natural manner. Okay, so again, God's not going to destroy the world because of a bunch of foolish people. However, the world goes in its normal way. And those fools who worship them, they're going to ultimately be judged. Davar acher. Now they're going to give an example. Okay? Somebody steals a se'ah's worth of grains and then plants them. Now, dinu shelo titzmach, right? If God were to punish directly for actions, then theoretically the person should not gain benefit from that and they shouldn't grow. But ela olam kiminago noheg, but the world works in a natural way. V'holech, right? Olam kiminago noheg v'holech, and goes on. V'shotim shekalkalu atidin litein atidin, and just that thief will ultimately be judged for the terrible thing they did. It's not like their crop's not going to grow because of it. But this is all kind of explaining also Rasha v'Tovlo, how we have bad people who look like they're having a good life. Another example. Man commits adultery. Dinu shalo titaber, shouldn't get pregnant from that. But the world goes in its natural way. The woman gets pregnant. But those foolish people who sinned will ultimately be punished for it. And then this is what Rish Lakish says. The God says, Lo dayan l'reshaim shosim sela sheli pumbi, ela shematrichim oti umachtimim oti ba'al korchi. This is a great line. This is God saying about the woman who gives birth from having committed adultery. It's not enough that people are taking my sela and making it public. In other words, using my stamp, which is basically the ability to create humans. But not only that, but they're bothering me. They're making me also put my stamp of approval on. In other words, the idea is that God is involved in every birth, and they're using God's ability to procreate. That God gave them, and they're using it in a sinful manner. And they need God to get involved to help the baby be born. Like, what a crazy thing! The God has to get involved, but it's only to continue the world working in a natural way. It doesn't mean they won't get punished for it. So now we have, instead of the philosophers asking the rabbis, we have a particular interaction between two people, this philosopher and Rabban Gamliel. God, your God is like fire consuming, is a very vengeful God. So why does God punish the people who worship the idol, but not the idol itself? Amar lo em sholach hamashal. So he says, I'll give you a parable. Lemana devar domeh. What's this like? Lemelech basar v'dam. Shaya lo ben echad. He had one son. V'oto ben hayam gadel lo et hakelev v'hela lo shem al shem aviv. So he had a dog, and he called the dog by the name of his father. Ukeshu nishpa amal b'chayei kelev abba. When he swears, he says, in the life of my kelev and my father's name, because it's my father's name, right? The dog's name is my father's name. Now, the father's angry because of the dog's name, that is his name, right? And that he's being used to make these oaths. But is he angry at the dog, or is he angry at his son? right? Alabenu koes or alakelevu koes. Which one is he angry at, the dog or the son? Have omer alabenu koes. Of course, upset at the son. Amar lo kelev ata koreh ota v'halo yesh bo mamash. Says, what, you're calling my idol a dog? My idol is not a dog. My idol is way more important than a dog. Amarlo umara'ita. He said, on what basis do you say that your idol is more than a dog? Amarlo pamachat naflad lekabi reinu v'nisrafa kol ha'ir kula. He said, one day there was a fire. Everything got destroyed. V'oto beit avodah zarah lo nisraf. And the only thing that didn't get destroyed was the house of worship for the temple. Doesn't that prove my idol means something? Amarlo, to which Rabban Gamliel says, Emshol lecha mashal, he's got a mashal for everything. Lema davar domeh, what is this similar to? Lemelech basar v'dam shesarcha alav medina. It's a melech, it's a king who the nation went against him. And Kishua Samilchama, now who does he get angry at when he goes out to war? He fights against the people who are alive in the city or the people who are dead in the city. Obviously, he's only going to fight the live people. The dead people are already dead. Okay, so basically he's saying that's why God didn't bother destroying your temple because it was dead anyway, right? It doesn't mean anything. Amarlo, koreota. So now he has a different problem. You're comparing my idol to a dog. Mate ata koreota. You're calling it a dead, and it's bad enough you called it a dog. Now you're calling my idol dead. How could you do that? Imken yabdena min haolam. If it's really dead, then it should be gone from this world. Amarlo, ilu davar she'en haolam tzarich lo hayu avdin harei mevatla. But harei movdim lachamal levana lakochavim u'mazalot. Again, we go back to this whole thing. Why is it still there? Because your gods are things that the world needs. And la'afikim v'lege'ayot, right, to the horizons and to the valley. Ge'ayot are, I don't know, I guess valleys maybe, right? The Gebeninom, the valleys. Ya'abed olamo mipnei shotim. Okay, so again, God's not going to destroy the world because of foolish people. So there you have all these interesting philosophical discussions. You can see why this is kind of the break in between the transition to the next section. This is sort of ending saying, why doesn't God get involved and destroy? And the answer is because olam kimina go no hek. God doesn't get involved in that way. It's a fascinating discussion that we'll finish for today. So what did we do today? We started with the small thing about the avanim on the altar. Then we got to this contradiction. We had two answers to the contradiction of how can you actually forbid someone of someone else's? Either that's not really what it's talking about, or it's actually talking about whether it's really your own and ones is not what we thought, or it's saying you actually did an action to it, and doing an action actually can forbid someone else's object. And then we had a bunch of other examples of things that generally aren't forbidden, like land and animals, but if you do something to them, you actually could forbid them, or you trade them for something. And from there, we got into the chalipin and the chalipe chalipin. We had a whole back and forth there with two different opinions. And then we got into this long discussion of philosophers with the rabbis about how God leaves idols in the world if idol worship is so terrible. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.